Northern Montana, February 1948. Dawn breaks across frozen prairie, pale light touching corrugated steel. The roof curves like a half-buried barrel catching gold in shadow. Two thin columns of smoke rise from opposite ends, dark against winter sky. Smoke that defies explanation. Smoke that shouldn't exist, not like that, not from a Quonset hut. Inside, three children sleep under single wool blankets. The walls hold no frost. No ice crystals pattern the windows. No condensation drips from the curved ceiling overhead. The floor bare pine boards salvaged from a dismantled barn stays warm enough that small feet can pad across it without flinching. A woman moves between two cast iron stoves, feeding each a single split log. Not large fires, not roaring flames, just steady heat, just enough. 2 miles down the frozen road, families huddle around dying fires wrapped in every piece of fabric they own. Their children sleep in coats and wool socks. Their walls weep moisture that freezes before morning. Their wood piles shrink daily, burn through faster than hands can split replacements. They burn hot and desperate and still wake shivering. The difference between the two realities measures 38 degrees Fahrenheit. 38 degrees that separate suffering from comfort. 38 degrees that shouldn't exist according to every expert who studied metal structures and cold climate physics. 38 degrees that began with a decision everyone called reckless. What did Helen Vickers understand about heat in airflow that everyone else missed? What made her place two chimneys where conventional wisdom said one already wasted fuel? The answer didn't come from engineering textbooks, didn't emerge from careful calculation. It came from desperation meeting observation from necessity, forcing innovation from a winter so brutal it killed the weak and taught the survivors. But that knowledge cost a season of suffering, cost a daughter's health, cost the respect of neighbors who watched and whispered and waited for the inevitable failure. The warmth of February 1948 was bought with the cold of the year before. 12 months earlier, Helen Vickers stood in spring mud, 31 years old, three children at her skirts, staring at pieces of a future she couldn't quite imagine. War widow. The telegram had arrived 2 years back, words that turned a husband into a memory and a shared life into a solitary struggle. No pension large enough to matter, no family close enough to help. Just a homestead claim 60 miles from the nearest town that offered a doctor or a proper store and a bank account that held $87. Her oldest, Thomas, was 9. Serious eyes, quiet hands, too much awareness of how little they had. Margaret, 7, still believed problems could be solved if everyone just tried harder. Sarah, the youngest, at 5, coughed sometimes in a way that made Helen's chest tighten with worry she couldn't afford to indulge. The homestead came with 160 acres, a foundation of railroad ties someone had started, and abandoned a well that still drew clean water, and absolutely nothing else. No cabin, no barn, no shelter beyond a canvas tent that wouldn't survive a single Montana winter. Lumber prices had climbed after the war, every veteran with a government loan trying to build something permanent. A proper timber cabin, sized for a family of 4, would cost $270 just for materials. Helen had priced it 3 times, hoping the numbers would change. They never did. Spring of 1947 brought an opportunity nobody else wanted. Fort Missoula was liquidating war surplus, selling off the temporary structures that had housed soldiers and equipment. Quonset huts, 20 feet wide, 48 feet long, curved steel shells that could be disassembled and hauled away for $35. Helen stood in the Fort Missoula yard, walked through the dim interior of one hut, ran her hand along corrugated metal that already sweated in mild spring weather. The seller, a tired sergeant processing paperwork for discharge, didn't try to oversell. These are summer sheds at best. You planning to store hay or equipment? Helen watched her children explore the empty space, their voices echoing off curved walls. Going to live in it. The sergeant paused, pen hovering over forms. Ma'am, I'm required to tell you these structures aren't rated for permanent habitation. especially not northern winters. The metal conducts heat right out. You'd be warmer in a tent with a good fire. Helen had done the math 3 dozen times, lying awake in the canvas shelter, calculating and recalculating. Lumber for a cabin, $270. This hut, $35. Hauling costs maybe another $15 if she could borrow Frank Morrison's truck and pay in labor. That left $37 for a stove chimney pipe, basic supplies, and everything else 3 children needed to survive. I'll take it. The sergeant made her sign extra papers, acknowledgement that she understood the limitations that the government bore no responsibility for structures used beyond their intended purpose. Helen signed everything, took a receipt, spent the next 2 weeks borrowing Frank Morrison's truck, making 3 trips to haul curved steel panels and support ribs and all the bolts and brackets needed to reassemble a military shelter into something called home. Her neighbors helped. Frank and his 2 grown sons spent a weekend setting ribs on the railroad tie foundation, bolting panels into place. The women brought food, watched the children, offered encouragement wrapped in doubt. Margaret Hollis, whose family had worked this valley for 2 generations, stood in the skeletal structure and tried to find hope to speak aloud. You'll get through summer fine. Come September, maybe you can find a teaching position in town. Rent a room somewhere warmer for winter. Helen thanked her, accepted the cornbread wrapped in cloth, said nothing about plans that extended beyond September. The hut took shape over 3 weeks. Curved walls, rose panels overlapped and sealed with tar paper and prayer. The roof, that distinctive half-cylinder that made Quonset huts recognizable from a distance, caught afternoon sun and reflected heat like a mirror. Inside, the space felt vast and strange. 48 feet of open area, no divisions, no privacy, just volume that would need heating. She positioned the stove dead center exactly as military manuals recommended. A potbelly stove salvaged from an abandoned mining camp, cast iron with a cracked door that is still sealed well enough. Chimney pipe ran straight up, penetrated the roof, extended 8 feet above to draw properly. Helen packed sand around the base, installed a heat shield of scrap metal to protect the floor. Spent her last $12 on enough stovepipe and flashing to do the job right. Thomas helped stuff insulation, old newspapers, and scrap fabric into gaps between panels. Margaret organized their few possessions, creating areas for sleeping and cooking, and the small table that served for meals and homework. Sarah, too young for real work, collected kindling from the cottonwood grove that bordered the property, proud of her contribution. By June, they moved from the tent into the hut. Summer proved the sergeant right about one thing: the metal structure stayed tolerable. Hot during afternoon when sun beat directly on steel, but survivable. Windows at each end, salvaged from a demolished farmhouse, provided cross-ventilation. At night, when temperature dropped, the space cooled quickly, but not dangerously. Helen began to believe the shape might work. She split wood through July and August, building a pile that should last 6 months based on calculations from a farmer's almanac. Stacked it under a lean-to framework, kept it dry. Felt each cord represent safety against coming cold. The children helped when they could, Thomas learning to swing an axe with increasing competence, Margaret bundling kindling into neat bundles. Neighbors visited less as summer faded, busy with their own harvests, their own preparations. But Helen caught the looks, saw Frank Morrison study her woodpile, his expression troubled. Heard Margaret Hollis mention casual, but pointed that a family in the next valley over was selling their claim, moving to Billings where winter housing didn't require gambling with children's lives. Helen kept splitting wood. September brought the first real test. Temperature dropped to 40 degrees one night, then 35 the next. Helen lit the stove for the first time as primary heat rather than just cooking fire. The warmth spread 15 feet in every direction, died somewhere around the 2/3 mark. At the far end of the hut, 40 feet from the stove, her breath made clouds. She adjusted, moved the sleeping area closer to the stove, hung wool blankets from the ceiling, creating a smaller space within the larger structure. Added more wood to the fire, kept it burning hotter. The heating pattern never changed. 15 feet of comfortable warmth, then gradual cooling, then a zone where cold settled and wouldn't leave. October arrived with frost and the first serious indication of what winter would mean. Condensation appeared on the walls each morning, moisture from breathing and cooking and the stove itself meeting cold metal and turning liquid. It ran down the curved walls and rivulets pooled along the base turned into ice overnight when temperature plunged. Helen wiped it down daily, wrung out rags, watched it reappear the next morning. The children started sleeping in coats, not because the area around the stove was cold, but because movement away from that central 15-foot radius meant entering zones where breath became visible and skin prickled. Thomas developed a routine of sprinting from the sleeping area to the far end, where they'd positioned a chamber pot, finishing his businesses as quickly as possible, sprinting back. November shattered any remaining illusions. The temperature dropped below zero for the first time on November 3rd. Helen woke to find ice crystals patterning the inside of the windows, frost coating the curved ceiling beyond the stove's influence. She fed the fire larger logs, kept it burning hotter than she'd planned. The warmth increased, but the radius didn't expand. Physics didn't care about need. The wood consumption terrified her more than the cold. She calculated 1 cord per month based on normal winter heating. By mid-November, she'd burned through almost 2 cords. The math became inescapable. 6 cords total, already down to 4, and winter had barely started. At current rates, she'd be out of fuel by February, with March and April still to endure. She burned smaller fires, fed the stove just enough to keep the immediate area survivable. The temperature inside the hut dropped to match the compromise. 45 degrees near the stove, below freezing at the far end. The children stayed huddled near the fire, wrapped in blankets, doing homework by inadequate light, losing the energy that children should have. Sarah's cough started December 4th. Small at first, just an occasional throat clearing. Within a week, it became persistent, a wet sound that rattled in her small chest. Helen boiled water. Created steam held Sarah close to breathe warm, moist air. The cough improved during the day when the fire burned steadier. Returned each night when Helen banked the stove to conserve fuel. Frank Morrison stopped by December 10th. Stood in the doorway, his sheepskin coat massive against the cold, his eyes taking in the frost-coated walls, the blanket partitions, the children huddled near the stove in multiple layers. His voice carried more resignation than judgment. "Helen, this isn't working. You know it's not working." Helen fed another log into the stove. "We're managing. That child is coughing. The walls are weeping. You're burning through wood faster than you can replace it. This is exactly what everyone said would happen. So what's your suggestion, Frank? Sell the claim, move to town, rent a room with money I don't have, take charity until my children learn that survival means dependence." Frank pulled off his hat, turned it in weathered hands. "I'm not trying to shame you. I'm trying to keep you alive. The worst of winter hasn't even hit yet, January. February, you're going to see temperatures that make this look mild. You can't heat sheet metal in those conditions. It's physically impossible." Helen looked at her children, at Sarah curled under blankets, despite being only 8 feet from the stove. Looked at the condensation running down walls, at the cold zone that started 15 feet from the fire and extended into a space that should be livable. "I'll figure something out." Frank left his expression suggesting he delivered a message he knew wouldn't be heeded. Helen listened to his truck fade into distance, then fed the stove another precious log. The neighbors stopped visiting after that. Not cruelty, just the natural pulling away that happens when people recognize a situation sliding toward inevitable failure. Margaret Hollis sent over a basket of preserves before Christmas, left it at the door without knocking. The gesture felt like condolence. Christmas Day brought clear skies and 15 below zero. Helen kept the stove burning steady, used extra wood she couldn't afford, gave her children one warm day. They sang carols, ate beans flavored with the last of the salt pork, pretended the cold zone at the far end didn't exist. Sarah's cough sounded worse in the echo of curved metal walls. The new year arrived with no celebration. Just another day of rationing wood, managing cold, watching the pile outside shrink toward a crisis that calculations said would arrive in 6 weeks. Helen split frozen logs when the sun was high enough to make the work possible. Her hands, even in gloves, cracked and bled. She wrapped them in cloth, kept splitting. January tested everything. A week of below zero nights, then 10 days where the temperature never climbed above 5 degrees, even at midday. The potbelly stove, designed for heating mining camps where men worked in shifts and fed it constantly, struggled against the relentless coal bleeding through corrugated steel. Helen burned it hotter, used more wood, gained no additional warmth. The physics mocked her. Heat rose from the stove, traveled along the curved ceiling, died somewhere around the 25-foot mark. The far end of the hut became uninhabitable, except for the brief periods when she overfed the fire. The cold settled there like a living thing, pulling warmth away from the spaces where her children needed to exist. She started studying the patterns, watching how heat moved, where it went, why it died. The curved ceiling seemed to create a channel, warm air rising and traveling along the arch until it cooled enough to sink. But it didn't sink back near the stove where it could be reheated. It sank at the far end, creating a cold pocket that pulled constantly at the warm zone, draining it, forcing the stove to work harder just to maintain inadequate comfort. One stove, one fire, one massive problem that no amount of wood could solve. You couldn't heat a curve the way you heated a square room. The military had used these structures for storage, for temporary shelter, where men could layer clothing and endure discomfort for a few months before shipping overseas. They'd never intended families to winter in corrugated steel 60 miles from help. Late January, Helen burned the last of her third cord. 3 cords remaining, maybe 4 weeks at current consumption, then decisions she couldn't bear to consider. Sell the claim for whatever someone would pay for railroad ties and use steel. Move to town, find work that probably didn't exist for widows with 3 children and no skills beyond farm work. Rent a room in a boarding house, watch her homestead dream collapse into charity and dependence. She sat by the stove one night after the children slept, watching firelight play across curved walls that wept and froze and bled her family's warmth into Montana darkness. Sarah's cough punctuated the silence, wet and persistent. Thomas shifted in his sleep, pulling blankets tighter against cold that came from 10 feet away. Margaret's breath made small clouds above her blanket. Helen had fought for this, bought surplus steel when everyone said it was madness, assembled it alone with borrowed help, fed her children and kept them sheltered, and refused to admit defeat when wisdom said defeat was the only rational option. But wisdom might be right, physics might be immutable, and the cold might win simply because warmth couldn't spread through a curved space using a single central fire. She didn't plan to quit, but the math allowed no other conclusion. February 3rd brought a thaw, temperature climbing to 28 degrees. Helen spent the afternoon splitting wood, extending a pile that wouldn't last regardless. The sun felt warm on her back, a temporary mercy. She noticed the wagon before she heard it, the jingle of harness bells carrying across frozen prairie. Silas Webb, traveling tinker, pulled up with a wagon full of scrap metal, used tools, and salvaged goods nobody else wanted. Helen knew him slightly, had traded eggs for a replacement kettle the previous summer. He stepped down from the wagon, tipped his hat, studied the Quonset hut with the expression of someone calculating possibilities. Making it through the winter in that thing? Barely. Silas walked to his wagon, dropped the tailgate, revealed an assortment of items that might matter or might be worthless depending on need. Cast iron pans with broken handles, chimney pipe in various states of rust, a box stove smaller than Helen's potbelly with a visible crack along one side. He tapped the crack with a gloved finger. Firebox is damaged, draws fine burns, steady, just weeps a little smoke if you pack it too full. Can't sell it to anyone for full price. But for someone who needs heat more than perfection, $15 or 3 cords of split wood. Helen looked at the stove, looked at the far end of her hut where cold defeated every attempt at warmth, looked at her wood pile at the 3 cords remaining that wouldn't last until spring. The mathematics of the transaction made no sense. Trade fuel for a broken stove that would consume more fuel, accelerate the crisis in exchange for equipment that couldn't solve the underlying problem. But something shifted in her thinking. Not calculation, not rational analysis, just a sudden recognition that fighting the same battle with the same tools guaranteed the same defeat. The far end stayed cold because heat rose and died and couldn't reach it. One fire couldn't heat 48 feet of curved space no matter how much wood it consumed. What if the far end had its own fire? The thought arrived fully formed, bypassing the part of her mind that calculated and planned. Two stoves, two fires. The impossibility of heating the entire curve from a central point, replaced by the possibility of heating from both ends, meeting somewhere in the middle. Every expert who commented on her situation had emphasized the wastefulness of metal structures. Adding a second stove would double the fuel consumption, double the loss, achieve nothing but faster depletion of resources. William Ketchum, the Valley's most experienced metalworker, had explained it patiently. Curved steel bleeds heat through conduction. More fires just bleed more heat. You don't solve a thermal problem by adding heat sources. You solve it by insulating, which you can't do adequately with corrugated panels. Helen heard those words, remembered them, knew they came from 20 years of building grain silos and barn roofs and structures meant to endure. But William Ketchum had never tried to keep children warm in a space designed for temporary military storage. Had never watched a daughter cough herself awake because cold pooled 15 feet from the only heat source. I'll take it, Silas raised an eyebrow. You already have a stove, I know. Gonna put this one somewhere else, heat. A separate building. Helen pointed to the far end of the hut, 40 feet from where they stood. Right there, opposite end from the first stove. Silas followed her gesture, his expression shifting from professional salesmanship to genuine confusion. Ma'am, I'm not sure that's going to help. You'll just be burning twice the wood for the same amount of cold. Maybe, but what I've got now isn't working. Silas studied her for a long moment, saw perhaps the determination that had carried a widow through a Montana winter in a steel shell everyone said was uninhabitable. Saw the choice between orthodox failure and desperate innovation. He nodded slowly, 3 cords of split wood delivered when you can. And Helen, I hope you're right. Helen didn't hope. Hope required believing in outcomes that seemed possible. She just knew that continuing the current path led to certain failure, and trying something different might lead to different failure or might lead somewhere no one expected. The only way to find out was to act. Thomas helped carry the stove inside the cast iron heavy enough that they had to rest twice. They positioned it at the far end 40 feet from the potbelly. Helen measured twice, marked the ceiling, drilled a hole through corrugated steel, using a bit borrowed from Frank Morrison, and never returned. Ran chimney pipe through sheet metal, flashing sealed every gap with furnace cement, used the last of it, and hoped it would hold. 2 stoves, 2 chimneys, 2 separate fires and 600 square feet of curved steel. The second chimney pipe extended 8 feet above the roof, matching the first, creating a symmetry that made the hut look different from every other Quonset structure in 3 counties. Frank Morrison stopped by the next morning, his truck appearing before Helen had finished her first cup of coffee. He stood in the doorway staring at the second stove, at the new chimney pipe, at the configuration that violated every principle he understood about heating and fuel efficiency. Helen, what in God's name are you doing trying to stay warm? Frank stepped inside, walked to the new stove, examined the installation. You're going to burn through twice the wood for the same result. Heat doesn't work that way in metal. It just bleeds out faster. You add more fires, you add more surface area, losing warmth. Basic thermodynamics. Maybe. There's no maybe about it. William Ketchum built structures for 20 years. He told you metal conducts heat. That's not opinion. It's physics. You're not solving the problem, Helen. You're making it worse. Helen fed a small log into the potbelly stove, watched the flames adjust. I've been doing what everyone said was right. Central stove, proper installation, careful fuel management. And my daughter coughs every night because the cold won't leave. So I'm trying something different. Different isn't better if it's still wrong. Then I'll be wrong faster and we can move on to whatever comes next. Frank left without another word, his truck kicking up frozen dirt. Helen watched him go, then prepared to light the second stove for the first time. She'd split 2 additional cords worth of wood over the past month, working every moment the temperature allowed. Between the 3 cords she'd promised Silas in the accelerated consumption, 2 stoves would require she had maybe 4 weeks before the wood ran out entirely. 4 weeks to prove something, or 4 weeks closer to admitting everyone had been right from the beginning. She crumpled newspaper, arranged kindling, struck a match. The second stove caught quickly the damaged firebox, drawing air properly despite the crack. She fed it small splits, building heat gradually. Across the hut, the potbelly stove already burned steady. 2 fires, 2 sources of warmth, 2 columns of smoke rising from opposite ends of a curved steel roof. The children watched with a mixture of hope and confusion. Thomas, old enough to understand the arithmetic of wood consumption, looked worried. Margaret, ever optimistic, smiled at the second fire like it was a solution already proven. Sarah just coughed, a sound that cut through warmth and cold equally. Helen didn't know if the experiment would work. Didn't know if she'd just accelerated their defeat or discovered something that might save them. She only knew that continuing to freeze while following expert advice felt like a slower version of the same ending. So she fed both fires, kept them small, kept them steady, and waited to see what physics would do when given 2 heat sources instead of 1. Outside neighbors who happened past on the frozen road saw the 2 chimneys, saw the double smoke, saw evidence of desperation they'd predicted months ago. Inside, Helen Vickers tended fires and watched her children and hoped that different might somehow become better. The woodpile shrank, the calendar advanced, and the winter that had already proven brutal prepared to deliver temperatures that would test everything. That first night, Helen fed both fires small, not roaring, just steady, waited for the inevitable. Twice the fuel consumption, same result, Frank Morrison's prediction turning true in real time. She prepared herself for failure measured in wood burned and no additional warmth gained. But something shifted within the first 2 hours. The heat moved differently. Warm air rose from the potbelly stove, traveled along the curved ceiling exactly as it always had. But instead of dying at the far wall, cooling and sinking into that dead zone that had plagued every previous night, it met rising heat from the second stove. The 2 currents pushed against each other, creating pressure that had nowhere to go but down. The warm air descended through the middle of the space, cycling back toward the floor, pulled into the updrafts from both stoves, heated again, sent along the ceiling to meet and descend once more. A loop. Continuous circulation where before there had been only linear movement and death. Helen stood in the center of the hut, 48 feet from either fire, and felt warmth on her face. Not the blast furnace heat of standing close to the potbelly, just comfortable air moving alive. She walked to the far end where Sarah's cough had echoed for months. The floor felt warm under her boots. Not hot, but warm enough that bare feet wouldn't recoil. The condensation pattern changed. The walls still sweated near each stove where heat met cold metal most directly. But the middle sections, the areas that had wept constantly, stayed drier. Less moisture in the air meant less heat lost to evaporation, meant less water running down to freeze at the base of the walls. Thomas woke sometime past midnight, climbed out from under his blankets to use the chamber pot. He walked barefoot across the floor without the usual sprint, without the desperate hurry of someone escaping cold. When he returned, he stopped beside Helen. "It's different." Helen touched his shoulder, felt the relaxed weight of a child no longer tensed against constant chill. Yes, Margaret slept without the restless shifting that came from fighting cold through dreams. Sarah's breathing, usually interrupted by coughing, held steady for hours at a stretch. The fires burned low, fed minimally, consuming less wood than the single potbelly had required to maintain inadequate heat. Helen stayed awake through the night, watching measuring in ways that had nothing to do with thermometers. She added 1 log to each stove every 90 minutes, 2 logs total per 3 hours. The previous week, burning only the pot belly, she'd fed it a log every 45 minutes and still watched her children shiver. By dawn, she'd burned 4 logs between both stoves. A mental calculation suggested Frank Morrison, half a mile away with his conventional fireplace, had likely burned 9 trying to heat a timber cabin built according to proper specifications. She didn't tell anyone, didn't have words to explain what she observed, just kept both fires going low and steady, watched her children wake in warmth. They hadn't known for months and waited for neighbors to notice the second chimney. The noticing happened faster than expected. By mid-February, everyone within 5 miles knew that Helen Vickers had installed a second stove in her steel shed. The interpretation of that knowledge varied depending on who spoke it, but the common thread ran toward pity mixed with exasperation. At the feed store, men gathered around the pot-belly stove that heated the building, their own ironic monument to single-source heating. Carl Henderson mentioned at first, his tone carrying the false brightness of someone sharing unfortunate news. Heard Helen's burning 2 fires now in that Quonset. Guess one wasn't enough to keep sheet metal warm. Laughter rippled through the assembled men, not cruel but resigned. The universal language of poor decisions, witnessed from a safe distance. Frank Morrison shifted his weight, looked uncomfortable, but didn't contradict. He'd seen the installation delivered, his warning been ignored. His silence confirmed what everyone suspected. Bill Patterson shook his head with the certainty of someone who'd never struggled. Woman doesn't understand that you can't beat physics. Metal bleeds heat. Doesn't matter if you got 1 fire or 10, you're just feeding the cold faster. She's trying. Frank finally offered, his voice quiet. 3 kids, no help, trying to make something work that probably won't. Can't fault the effort, can fault the waste. That's firewood she's burning for nothing. Come March, she'll be out of fuel and no better off than if she'd used half as much. The conversation moved on to crop prices and spring planting. But the story stuck. Helen Vickers, with her 2 stoves burning through wood at double rate, too stubborn or too ignorant to recognize defeat. By the time it reached the women's social circles, the details had shifted slightly, but the conclusion remained identical. Margaret Hollis mentioned it to her daughter-in-law, while Canning preserves her voice, carrying genuine concern beneath the judgment. I saw smoke from both ends of that hut yesterday. 2 fires going at once. Poor thing must be desperate, thinking more heat will somehow make metal hold warmth. Martha Hollis, younger and less practiced at tempering criticism with sympathy, spoke more directly. Someone should tell her she's just making it worse. More fires mean more surface area losing heat. It's basic science. Someone probably has told her. Helen doesn't take advice well. Pride's going to freeze those children. The story evolved as it spread. By March, Helen had acquired a nickname she never asked for and would carry for years. Double Stove Lady. Said with a smile, said with pity, said with that particular condescension reserved for people who don't know when conventional wisdom exists for a reason. Children heard it at school. Sarah came home one afternoon in early April, quiet in a way that signaled hurt rather than illness. She waited until after supper, until Thomas and Margaret had gone to their sleeping area before speaking. "Mama, why does everyone say our house is wrong?" Helen set down the pan she'd been scrubbing, turned to face her youngest daughter. "Who said that? Emily Patterson. She said her daddy told her we have 2 stoves because we're too poor to heat a real house, and that you don't understand how fires work." Helen pulled Sarah close, felt the small body that had stopped coughing 2 weeks after the second stove began operating. The question deserved honesty, but honesty often looked like excuses when spoken aloud to a 7-year-old trying to navigate schoolyard hierarchies. "Our house is different. Different makes some people uncomfortable, so they call it wrong. But you're warmer now than you were at Christmas." "That's not wrong." Emily said, "We're wasting wood." "Are you warm when you sleep?" "Yes." "Then we're not wasting anything that matters." Sarah seemed satisfied, or at least willing to set aside questions that had no answers. she could carry back to school. Helen held her daughter and wondered how many more conversations like this would come, how many small cruelties children absorbed from parents who spoke their judgments within earshot. The criticism from adults landed harder because it came wrapped in expertise. William Ketchum stopped by in May, ostensibly to return a borrowed shovel, but really to deliver an assessment he felt obligated to provide. He stood outside the hut, studied both chimneys like they represented a personal insult to physics, his 20 years of metalworking experience, unable to reconcile what he saw with what he knew. Helen, I'm going to tell you this because I respect your effort, even if I don't understand your reasoning. Curved steel bleeds heat through conduction. That's thermodynamics, not opinion. You add more fire, you just create more surface area losing warmth. You're not solving the problem. You're feeding it. Seems warmer to me. William's expression shifted to something between patience and frustration. Feeling isn't measuring. You might perceive warmth because you're burning more fuel, but the actual thermal efficiency has decreased. You're working twice as hard for the same failure, just distributed differently. My daughter stopped coughing. That could be any number of factors, coming her immune system strengthening natural recovery. You can't attribute health outcomes to a heating configuration that violates basic engineering principles. Helen studied this man who'd built grain silos and barn roofs across 3 counties, whose knowledge came from calculations and experience and proven methods. He meant well, believed he was saving her from wasted effort, but he'd never spent January nights watching ice form on interior walls while a child coughed 15 feet from a roaring fire. I appreciate your concern, William. Truly, but I'm staying warmer using less wood than I did with one stove. That's not feeling, that's counting logs. William opened his mouth closed. It looked at the wood pile that should have been empty by now. If the mathematics of dual heating played out as predicted, the evidence troubled him more than the configuration. Numbers didn't lie, but neither did remaining fuel. He left with a handshake and a warning to prepare for next winter, to plan for failure of the system before cold arrived and options narrowed. Helen thanked him, meant it, and went back to maintaining fires that worked in ways she couldn't articulate but could observe. The women approached differently, their concern dressed in offers of help that assumed eventual surrender. At the church social in June, Martha Hollis touched Helen's arm with the gentle pressure of someone delivering difficult truth. Honey, nobody thinks less of you for struggling. That hut was never meant for families. Why don't you let the men help you plan something proper for next winter? A timber addition maybe, or a small cabin you could move into while keeping the Quonset for storage. Helen accepted a glass of lemonade, kept her expression neutral. We're managing fine. For now, because it's summer. But come November, you'll be right back where you started. Worse, actually, because you've used extra wood, proving something everyone already knew wouldn't work. What did I prove? Martha's smile carried sadness underneath. That good intentions can't change physics, dear. That sometimes we have to accept limits and plan accordingly, rather than fighting battles we can't win. The conversation ended. They're shifted to safer topics like canning recipes and whose son was courting whose daughter. But Helen left the social aware that the entire community had written her off as stubborn, at best dangerously deluded at worst. Come winter, they expected her to fail, sell the clay move somewhere that didn't require gambling, with children's lives on theories that contradicted everything known about metal and heat. She went home and made adjustments, moved the second stove 2 feet closer to the wall, improving the draft pattern, added a damper to the chimney pipe, giving her control over airflow and heat intensity, positioned flat stones at the base of each stove, sandstone pieces that absorb warmth during the day and radiated it back at night. The mass helped maintain temperature through the hours between feedings, let the fires burn lower without losing comfort. Summer passed into autumn without drama. Helen's split wood expanded the pile beyond what calculations suggested she'd need. Better to have excess than run short and prove everyone right. Thomas grew strong enough to handle an axe with real efficiency. Margaret organized their living space with increasing sophistication, creating zones that served different purposes while maintaining the open flow that let heat circulate. The hut stopped looking temporary, started looking intentional. That shift made some neighbors more uncomfortable than the original desperate configuration. A proper homestead had one hearth, one fire, one center to the home. This double chimney arrangement suggested permanence without conforming to tradition, implied success through methods that shouldn't work. Frank Morrison muttered to his wife one evening in October, watching smoke rise from both ends of the vicar's place as he drove past. "It's not how a home should look. Like she's trying to heat the whole county instead of just admitting the building's wrong for the purpose." His wife, quieter but no less certain, agreed. Desperate is one thing, stubborn past reason is another. Those children deserve better than a mother who can't recognize when she's beaten. But Helen wasn't trying to prove anything beyond keeping her family warm. The validation she needed came each morning when her children woke without shivering, each night when Sarah slept without coughing. The neighbors' opinions mattered less than the temperature inside four corrugated walls. October brought frost and the first test of whether summer preparations would translate to winter survival. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees one night in late October. Helen lit both fires, burned them small and steady. The hut maintained 62 degrees wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling. She burned 3 logs total through the night, less than she'd consumed with a single stove the previous October, trying to maintain 45 degrees in a 15-foot radius. The mathematics didn't make sense according to conventional understanding. But the wood pile, still substantial despite months of cooking and heating, suggested that something about the dual fire configuration defied prediction. November arrived early and Arctic, not the usual autumn chill that signaled winter's approach. Something biblical air that had been born in places where ice never melted, riding winds that cut through wool and wood and hope with equal indifference. November 7th, the temperature hit 18 degrees at sunset. By midnight, it had dropped to 4 below. By dawn, -18. And it stayed there. Not one cold night that could be endured through extra effort and sacrificed sleep. 5 days, 5 nights, temperature, never climbing above zero even when sun touched frozen earth. The kind of cold that cracked trees, that froze livestock, standing in fields that killed the unprepared and tested everyone else. Helen's neighbors burned through their November wood piles in 3 days. Families moved into single rooms, hanging blankets across doorways to trap heat in smaller spaces. The Morrison cabin, built proper with timber and plaster, had a fireplace that Frank fed continuously. Logs every 40 minutes, flames roaring, consuming cords of split pine and still losing ground to cold that didn't care about effort or expense. Frank and his sons took shifts through the nights, one awake to maintain the fire while others slept in layers that made movement difficult. Even then, frost formed on walls 6 feet from the hearth. Water buckets froze overnight. The barn, less well heated, became a question of which livestock could survive versus which would be lost to cold that penetrated every gap and crack. 2 miles south, the Carver family's chimney developed a crack from thermal shock, the constant expansion and contraction of stone subjected to extreme temperature swings. They couldn't risk continuing to burn with a compromised chimney, couldn't survive without heat. They loaded their children into a wagon and drove to the Hollis place, where 8 people crowded into 4 rooms and burned wood faster than 2 families could split it. Across the valley, families made similar calculations. Combined households share heat hope. The wood lasted long enough for the cold to break. Hope that chimneys held, that fires didn't catch, that children stayed healthy, despite crowding and stress, and the constant fight against air so cold it hurt to breathe. The valley held its breath, waited for temperatures to climb, prayed that fuel would outlast the Arctic mass that had settled over Montana like judgment. At the curved steel hut at the end of Vickers Road, Helen fed both stoves, not roaring, just steady. Small splits, slow burn, the rhythm she'd learned through months of observation and adjustment. She developed an instinct for it, a feel for how much fuel maintained the circulation pattern without overwhelming it. The children slept under single blankets, not piled layers, not coats and wool socks, just the same bedding they'd use on a cool autumn night. The floor stayed warm enough that Sarah walked barefoot to retrieve a forgotten book. Thomas did homework at the table without wearing gloves. Margaret cooked breakfast on the pot-belly stove without standing so close she risked burning herself. The windows held no ice. The walls showed condensation only in small patches near the stoves where heat met cold metal directly. The temperature inside the hut measured 64 degrees at the coldest point of the coldest night, maintained with 4 logs per 12 hours split between 2 fires. Frank Morrison, half a mile away, burned 9 logs in 6 hours just to keep his family's sleeping area above 40 degrees. The third night, Helen walked outside to retrieve more wood. The air hit like a physical blow, cold so intense it made her eyes water immediately. She loaded her arms quickly, hurried back inside, felt the warmth envelop her like water after drought. The contrast made her pause. Her hut, the structure everyone said couldn't be heated, maintained comfort, while proper houses struggled against the same cold. She didn't gloat, didn't feel vindicated, just felt grateful that something born from desperation had somehow worked in ways she still couldn't fully explain. On the morning of November 12th, the cold finally broke. Temperature climbed to 22 degrees, practically balmy compared to the previous 5 days. People emerged from their homes exhausted, moving stiffly, counting remaining wood, and calculating whether they could survive if another cold snap arrived before spring. William Ketchum drove past the vicar's place on his way to town, saw smoke still rising from both chimneys, saw Helen outside splitting wood. Not frantically, not with the desperate energy of someone facing imminent fuel shortage, just steadily, methodically adding to a pile that looked largely intact. He pulled over, unable to reconcile what he observed with what mathematics predicted. Walked to where Helen worked his boots, crunching on frozen ground. "How much wood you got left?" Helen pointed to the shed to cords of split pine stacked neatly. "Still half full." William stared, did the math. 5 days, brutal cold families, burning through weeks of fuel in less than one. She should be down to scraps, should be splitting desperately, should be facing the crisis everyone predicted. The numbers didn't work. How Helen set down her axe, pulled off gloves that were worn but not destroyed. 2 stoves, low and slow, seems to use less wood than one hot fire. That doesn't make sense. You're heating the same space with 2 sources. Should burn more, not less. Want to come inside and see? William hesitated, then nodded. He'd given his expert opinion months ago, had been certain in his assessment. But certainty meant nothing against observed reality. And the wood pile told a story that contradicted everything he understood about thermal efficiency in metal structures. He stepped into the hut, stopped just inside the door, felt warmth that didn't match expectations. Not the blast of overheated air that came from a fire burning too hot. Just comfortable temperature, even throughout the space. He walked to the center, 40 feet from either stove, and felt no cold spots. The air was moving. He could sense it, could feel circulation that he'd never noticed in properly heated buildings, because those buildings fought circulation trying to trap heat near the source. Here, the movement felt intentional, purposeful. He walked to the far end, where the second stove burned low and steady. Still warm. No transition from heated zone to cold zone, no gradient that made different areas of the building feel like different climates. Wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling, the temperature held consistent. Then he saw Helen's thermometer hanging on the curved wall near the table. 64 degrees. His house built proper with timber and plaster and a stone fireplace large enough to roast a pig had barely held 40 degrees during the worst of the cold snap. His family had slept in coats. His wife had wrapped hot stones in cloth and placed them in the children's beds to prevent freezing. How much warmer? Helen pulled out a scrap of paper covered in neat handwriting, numbers recorded daily through the cold snap. She'd been keeping notes documenting temperatures at her place and asking neighbors about theirs. The data told a story that William's expertise said couldn't be true. On the coldest night, November 9th, -22 outside Helen's hut had maintained 62 degrees. The Morrison cabin with its roaring fireplace, 24. The Hollis place where two families crowded together, 28, 38 degrees warmer, using half the wood. William Ketchum stood in that curved steel hut, a man who'd built structures across 3 counties, who understood load-bearing calculations and thermal conductivity and every engineering principle that governed how buildings worked, and realized he'd been completely wrong. The curve. The two fires create a convection loop. Heat doesn't just rise and bleed out through the metal, it circulates. The cold air gets pushed down and reheated before it can settle into dead zones. I don't know about all that, I just know it works. William pulled off his hat, turned it in hands that had shaped metal for 2 decades. Helen, I owe you an apology. I called you reckless. I told you that you were violating basic physics. I was certain you'd fail. You weren't alone in that certainty, but I should have measured before judging. Should have observed instead of assuming. You didn't just survive that cold snap. You did it more efficiently than anyone with a conventional heating system. That's not luck. That's innovation. Helen smiled, tired but without bitterness. Long as you don't charge me for the education. William looked at the two stoves, at their careful placement, at the stone bases and dampers, and the installation that he dismissed as desperate foolishness. Would you mind if I measure this setup, write it down proper? Helen gestured to the space. Measure whatever helps. William Ketchum spent 3 hours in Helen Vickers' hut that afternoon. Pulled a leather notebook from his truck, documented everything with the precision of someone who'd learned that assumptions kill good engineering. Distance between stoves, 42 feet. Height of chimneys above roof line, 8 feet each. Stove positioning both set 18 inches from the curved walls to allow air circulation behind the fire. Damper settings half open on both, creating steady draw without overconsumption. He measured the stone bases, flat sandstone pieces, roughly 30 pounds each, positioned under and beside each stove. Thermal mass, he explained to Helen. They absorb heat when the fire's burning strong, radiate it back when flames die down. Keeps the system from having to work as hard during overnight temperature drops. But the real discovery came when William dropped a handful of wood ash near the floor and watched it drift. The particles moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, rising near the potbelly stove, traveling along the curved ceiling, meeting the updraft from the second stove, then descending along the far wall and flowing back across the floor toward the first stove. A complete loop, continuous circulation driven by the competing updrafts from two heat sources positioned at opposite ends of a curved space. In a square room with one fire, the heat rises straight up, hits the ceiling, spreads outward until it cools enough to sink in the corners. You get hot spots near the fire, cold spots in the corners, dead air that doesn't move. In your setup, the curve works with you instead of against you. The two heat sources create competing updrafts that push warm air into constant motion. It can't settle, can't create cold pockets where heat dies. Helen watched the ash dance through invisible currents. So I'm not burning more heat. I'm just moving it better. Exactly. And because the air keeps circulating, you're not losing as much to the walls. Less contact time between warm air and cold metal means less conductive heat loss. The metal still bleeds warmth, that's unavoidable. But the air inside stays warm enough to compensate. The mathematics became simple once explained. Single stove in a Quonset hut meant heat rose, traveled 10 to 15 feet, died against physics that didn't care about need. Compensate by burning hotter, consuming more wood, still failing to solve cold zones. Two stoves properly positioned meant heat rose from both ends, created circulation, eliminated dead air, reduced the temperature gradient from hot to cold. Burn less per stove because the system wasn't fighting physics anymore, it was using physics. William recorded wood consumption based on Helen's careful notes. Approximately 40% less wood than comparable single stove structures during the cold snap. 40% not estimated or approximated, but measured through actual logs burned and temperatures maintained. He noted secondary benefits that Helen had observed but not quantified. Reduced condensation meant less heat lost to evaporation as moisture turned to vapor. Dry walls meant less thermal bridging through water that conducted cold more efficiently than dry metal. Stable temperatures meant less expansion and contraction of the steel, less structural stress, fewer gaps for drafts. And the children. Helen's three, who'd been watching from the corner while William measured and calculated. They were sleeping through nights now without waking cold. Sarah's cough, the persistent rattle that had marked October through February, had cleared within 2 weeks of the dual stove system beginning operation. How long have you known this worked? Since March. Maybe April, when I really trusted it enough to believe. And you didn't tell anyone? Helen's smile held no accusation, just weary knowledge. Would you have listened? William closed his notebook, looked at this woman who'd solved a problem he'd declared unsolvable, who'd proven expertise wrong through observation and necessity. No, I wouldn't have. By evening, word had spread, not through any announcement Helen made, but because William Ketchum couldn't stop talking about what he'd discovered. At the feed store, at the church, at every neighbor's table where he stopped to warm up on his way home. Helen Vickers has been 38 degrees warmer than the rest of us, burning half the wood, and we called her foolish. Frank Morrison heard it third hand from his son, who'd been in town. Drove out to see for himself that same evening, knocked on the curved metal door with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. If this was real, if there was a way to heat more efficiently, winter suddenly looked less like an enemy to be endured and more like a problem with solutions. Helen let him in without comment. Frank stood in the center of the space, felt even warmth, saw his breath disappear instead of making clouds. The temperature difference from his own cabin hit him physically, made him aware of how much cold he'd accepted as inevitable. I'll be damned, it's just physics. The curve in the two fires create circulation. No, Frank's voice held something between admiration and frustration. It's smarter than physics. It's observation. You watched what wasn't working and you fixed it. Most people just burn more wood and complain louder. Helen fed both fires small splits, maintained the circulation that kept her children comfortable. I didn't have wood to waste on complaining. Frank left with measurements in his head and plans already forming. He knew 2 other families with surplus Quonsets they'd been afraid to live in. Knew a widow in the next valley over who'd bought military surplus and then hesitated when reality of Montana winter became clear. Within a week, 4 families came to measure Helen's setup. She showed them everything, explained nothing in technical terms because she didn't have technical language for what she discovered. Just showed them the stoves, the positioning, the dampers and stone bases, and the way warmth moved through curved space when given 2 sources instead of 1. Within 2 weeks, the hardware store in town ordered extra chimney pipe. Couldn't keep it in stock. Every homesteader with a Quonset hut or dreams of making one livable wanted to try what everyone now called the Vickers method, though Helen had never named it anything at all. By December, the first copycat installation went up 3 miles south. Another war surplus Quonset, another woman homesteader whose husband hadn't returned from Europe. She positioned 2 stoves at opposite ends based on measurements copied directly from Helen's setup. Lit both fires on the first cold night of December, watched heat circulate in patterns that conventional wisdom said were impossible. It worked for her, too. The physics didn't care who understood them, only that the conditions were met. Curved space dual heat sources, proper positioning to create competing updrafts. Follow that formula and cold stopped being the enemy that metal magnified. Became just weather uncomfortable but manageable, survivable, without burning through resources faster than they could be replaced. The valley was learning, slowly, skeptically, because lessons that contradicted expert opinion always met resistance. But learning nonetheless, adapting, copying what observation proved functional, regardless of what theory predicted. Winter of 1948 became the year that conventional wisdom about Quonset huts changed from unsuitable for habitation to viable with proper heating configuration. Not through any official declaration or published study, just through neighbors watching, measuring, copying what worked. Helen Vickers' curved steel hut stopped being that sad metal shed and became the warm one. The place where innovation happened, not because someone studied engineering principles, but because someone needed warmth desperately enough to ignore expert advice and trust what she could see. Spring of 1949 brought William Ketchum his first commission, based on knowledge he'd resisted for months. A young couple from the eastern part of the state, newly arrived with government land grants, and wore surplus steel, stood in his workshop holding crude sketches of a Quonset hut they'd purchased but feared to inhabit. The husband spread the drawings across William's workbench with hands that showed recent labor calluses still forming. "We heard about a woman north of here who winters in one of these. Heard she's got some kind of special setup that keeps it warm." William studied the sketches, saw standard military specifications, single stove placement marked in the center. You heard right. Helen Vickers, about 6 miles that direction. She runs 2 stoves opposite ends, creates air circulation that makes the curve work for heating instead of against it. The wife leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd already lost money on poor decisions and couldn't afford another. "Does it really work? We've had 3 people tell us Quonsets can't be lived in through winter." "It works. I've measured it, documented temperatures and fuel consumption. She stays warmer using less wood than conventional structures because the dual heat sources create a convection loop." The husband traced the curve of the sketched roof with one finger, thinking through implications. "So we'd need 2 stoves, 2 chimneys, specific positioning." William pulled out his leather notebook, opened to pages dense with measurements and diagrams. "I can build you one from the start with the configuration already in place. Save you the trial and error Helen went through. Won't be cheap, but it'll be right." The commission took 3 weeks. William positioned railroad tie foundations with precision Helen had approximated through desperation. Marked stove locations 18 inches from the curved walls, exactly 42 feet apart, both at equal distance from the end panels. Installed chimney penetrations with proper flashing before the roof went up, sealed everything against Montana weather. He added modifications Helen hadn't considered because she'd been working with salvaged materials and minimal resources. Insulated the floor with sawdust, packed between joists, reducing heat loss through the ground. Created heat walls between the living area and the far end using stacked stone thermal mass that would absorb warmth during the day and release it through the night. The family moved in during April, ran cooking fires through spring and summer, waited for autumn to test whether borrowed innovation would translate to their specific situation. When October brought the first hard frost, they lit both stoves using the pattern William had documented from Helen's operation. Small fires, steady burn patience instead of panic. The hut warmed evenly. The curve, which they'd feared would magnify cold, instead channeled heat through continuous circulation. Their children slept without the layered blankets packed expecting misery. By November, they had become converts who spoke with the fervor of someone proving skeptics wrong. They mentioned it at the general store, at church gatherings, anywhere people discussed the practical difficulties of frontier life. Other families listened with the caution of people who had been promised solutions before and found only different versions of the same problems. But when December brought serious cold and their place maintained comfort, while neighboring conventional structures struggled, the skepticism shifted. Not to immediate acceptance, but to willingness to investigate. The failure of expertise to predict Helen's success had created space for observation to replace theory. A homesteader named Ruth Calloway took the concept and evolved it beyond simple duplication. She'd worked as a machinist during the war, understood heat transfer from industrial applications, saw possibilities Helen had never considered. Her Quonset hut, purchased from the same Fort Missoula surplus, became a laboratory for thermal efficiency. Ruth positioned 2 stoves at opposite ends following the established pattern. But instead of separate chimneys, she designed a shared flue system that channeled both exhaust streams through a central thermal mass chimney. built it from creek stones stacked tight with clay mortar, creating a column that ran floor to ceiling and massed nearly 2 tons. The chimney absorbed heat from both fires, became a massive radiator positioned exactly at the hut's midpoint. The dual fires heated the living space through circulation while simultaneously pumping warmth into stone that released it back for hours after flames died. Ruth's system held 55 degrees 6 hours after both fires went cold, coasting on stored thermal energy that conventional fireplaces wasted up the chimney. Her innovation impressed William Ketchum enough that he incorporated elements into his next 3 builds. Not the full central mass, which required more stone than most homesteaders could gather, but strategic placement of smaller heat walls that served similar purposes. The Vickers method, as people called it, despite Helen never claiming ownership, was evolving into variations adapted to specific needs and available resources. Not every experiment succeeded. A family near Dutton, eager to try dual heating but unclear on critical details, positioned both stoves on the same side of their Quonset. They followed the 42-foot spacing William recommended, but placed one stove at the front left, the second at the rear left, both along the same wall. The result was predictable to anyone who understood convection patterns, but invisible to homesteaders working from partial information. One side of the hut became unbearably hot. The opposite wall stayed freezing. The dual fires, instead of creating circulation, simply created 2 separate hot zones that didn't communicate. Heat rose from both stoves, traveled along the same section of curved ceiling, died against the far wall with nowhere to distribute. They endured 3 weeks of lopsided misery before swallowing pride and asking William to visit. He assessed the problem in minutes, explained the necessity of opposing positions, helped them relocate one stove to the opposite end. The correction took half a day of work. The improvement showed immediately. Stories like that spread as quickly as success stories, creating cautionary knowledge that refined understanding. The dual stove configuration wasn't magic that worked regardless of implementation. It was applied physics that required specific conditions. Opposite ends, equal distance from walls, matched chimney heights, balanced fuel feeding, follow those requirements, and curved steel became viable winter housing. Ignore them, and you just burn twice the wood for half the comfort. By late 1949, 14 Quonset huts within 50 miles had adopted dual chimney configurations. Some used matched stoves, some mixed sizes to create staggered heat output. Some built elaborate thermal mass systems, others relied on simple stone bases and careful fire management. The variations reflected individual circumstances available, materials, personal ingenuity applied to a proven framework. The spread happened quietly, practically. No newspaper articles celebrated the innovation. No government extension agent documented the technique for official distribution. Just neighbors watching, measuring, copying what worked. The way good ideas always propagate in communities where survival depends on paying attention to what produces results. Helen never became famous, never wrote instructions or gave lectures. She lived in her warm hut, raised her children, split wood every autumn, without the desperate edge that had marked 1947. When new homesteaders arrived, young couples with war surplus structures and tight budgets, the locals would point them toward Vickers Road. Talk to Helen about heating. She figured something out that matters, and they would come. Stand in the curved space, feel the even warmth, ask questions that Helen answered, without technical jargon because she'd never learned technical jargon. Just showed them the stoves, the spacing, the damper settings that produce circulation. Let them measure, take notes, copy what they needed. Some visitors expected complexity, assumed there must be secret knowledge that explained why this worked when conventional wisdom said it shouldn't. They'd press for details, looking for the trick they were missing. Helen's response never varied. 2 fires opposite ends, burn them low and steady. Let the air move instead of trying to force heat where it won't go. That's all, nothing else. That's enough. The simplicity frustrated people who'd been taught that solutions to difficult problems required sophisticated understanding. But frontier living had its own sophistication built from observation rather than education proven through results rather than credentials. Helen's innovation came from watching what failed, imagining what might work differently, trying it despite universal skepticism. Traditional knowledge didn't always arrive ancient and venerable. Sometimes it was born in a moment of desperation, discovered by accident, proven right by the coldest night anyone could remember. Spring of 1950 brought a young couple named David and Ellen Crawford to Helen's door. They'd bought a Quonset hut in pieces, hadn't assembled it yet, wanted to build it right from the beginning. David carried a notebook already filled with measurements, copied from William Ketchum, questions written in neat margins. Ellen, visibly pregnant and trying to hide concern about wintering in metal, studied Helen with the directness of someone evaluating whether to trust advice that contradicted everything she'd been told. "You really keep 3 children warm in here." Through January and February, Helen gestured to the spaced walls that showed no damage from condensation to a floor that remained sound. "My youngest slept barefoot most nights this winter, not because we couldn't afford socks, because she didn't need them." Ellen walked the length of the hut, 48 feet from where the potbelly stove sat to where the second stove held position. Stopped at the midpoint, equidistant from both heat sources. "This is where it would be coldest in a normal building, and isn't it? The spot furthest from the fire." "Usually, yes." Ellen stood still, eyes closed, feeling for cold spots that should exist, according to every house she'd ever lived in. Found even temperature instead. When she opened her eyes, something had shifted in her expression. "Okay, we'll do it this way." David built their Quonset following Helen's proven spacing with additions from William's refined technique. Positioned the stoves precisely installed, matched chimneys, created stone bases that would absorb and release heat. Ellen gave birth in September, a daughter they named Catherine, and the family spent their first winter in corrugated steel without the suffering Helen had endured during her initial attempt. Their success represented knowledge transfer working as intended. Helen's painful learning translated into avoided suffering for families who came after. The frontier didn't reward everyone equally, but it did reward those who learned from others' experiments, instead of insisting on repeating every mistake personally. Winter of 1950 brought another Arctic snap, though less severe than the brutal cold of November 1948. Temperature dropped to -15, stayed there for 3 days. Families with dual-stove Quonsets weathered it with discomfort, but without crisis. Families in conventional structures burned through wood at rates that depleted monthly supplies in days. Frank Morrison, whose skepticism had given way to grudging acceptance, stopped fighting what observation proved. He mentioned Helen's technique to a nephew considering homesteading, recommended William Ketchum for installation, acknowledged that sometimes innovation came from unexpected sources. The women's circles, which had whispered about double stove lady with pity and condescension, shifted their assessment as years passed without the predicted collapse. Margaret Hollis, whose certainty about Helen's eventual failure had been absolute, found herself explaining the dual fire configuration to a new arrival in spring of 1951. "You want even heat in a curved space, you need heat sources at opposite ends. Create circulation that makes the metal work for you instead of against you." Helen Vickers figured it out. Took some courage to try what everyone said was foolish. The transformation of judgment into admiration happened slowly and completely. Some neighbors never quite forgave Helen for being right when they'd been certain she was wrong. Others embraced the innovation while minimizing her role, attributing success to William Ketchum's engineering knowledge or Ruth Calloway's thermal mass improvements. But the children who'd grown up in dual-stove Quonsets knew differently. They'd experienced warmth where cold should have dominated, had slept through Montana winters without the suffering their parents remembered from conventional housing. When they grew old enough to build their own homes, some chose timber and proper construction. Others chose surplus steel and proven heating patterns, comfort over convention. By 1952, the dual-stove Quonset had become common enough that it stopped being remarkable. Just another adaptation and another example of frontier practicality meeting engineering necessity. New arrivals asking about winter housing got directed to examples scattered across 3 counties. Some built perfectly matched installations following Williams' refined specifications. Others improvised with salvaged stoves and approximate spacing, succeeding through attention to core principles rather than exact duplication. The knowledge had entered circulation, become community property, evolved beyond any single person's innovation. Helen's contribution was acknowledged by those who'd watched the progression from desperate experiment to proven technique. But acknowledgement didn't translate to fame or even widespread recognition outside the immediate valley. She remained Helen Vickers' widow, with 3 children, woman who worked her homestead and helped neighbors when asked, and lived in a way that had stopped attracting comment. The curved steel hut was just her house now, notable only for being consistently warm. William Ketchum, in a moment of reflection, while installing a dual stove system for a family recently arrived from Ohio, tried to articulate what Helen's innovation represented. He stood with the husband, a man named Joseph, who'd served in Europe and returned determined to claim land the government promised veterans. You didn't just solve a heating problem. William watched smoke rise from chimneys not yet fully operational. You changed how people think about curved structures, made them viable for year-round living in cold climates. That's not small. Joseph studied the configuration, the careful spacing, the matched heights. One woman figured this out, just watching how heat moved and trying something different. One woman who didn't have resources to fail conventionally, so she succeeded unconventionally. Most important innovations work that way. Necessity forcing observation, forcing experimentation, forcing discovery. The conversation ended, there moved to technical details about damper installation and fuel loading patterns. But the acknowledgement mattered. Helen's legacy wasn't fame or even broad recognition. It was knowledge that prevented suffering, solutions that worked when implemented properly, proof that observation could trump expertise when expertise missed essential patterns. Thomas Vickers, Helen's oldest, turned 16 in summer of 1952. Old enough to remember the brutal first winter in vivid detail, old enough to understand what his mother had accomplished through desperation and stubbornness. He helped install a dual stove system for a neighbor that summer, explained the spacing requirements, demonstrated proper fire management. The neighbor, an older man who'd farmed this valley for 30 years, listened with the attention of someone who'd learned that age didn't guarantee wisdom. Your mother must be proud. Not many people change how things get done around here. Thomas positioned a stove base with the precision learned from years of observation. She doesn't talk about it much, just shows people when they ask and goes back to her work. That's how the best knowledge spreads, not through bragging, through helping. Margaret Vickers, 14 now and increasingly interested in teaching, kept detailed notes on the various Quonset configurations scattered across the county. She documented who used what stove types, what spacing variations worked, which thermal mass approaches produced best results. Her notebook became an informal reference that William Ketchum borrowed when designing new installations, returning it with additional observations and margins. Sarah, 12 and healthy in ways that seemed impossible during those coughing winters, barely remembered the cold. Her childhood had been defined by warmth, by a mother who'd refused to accept freezing as inevitable. When asked about growing up in a Quonset hut, she described it as normal, unremarkable, just home. The normalization of what had been radical represented the deepest success. Innovation that became ordinary experiment, that became standard practice solutions so thoroughly proven, they stopped requiring explanation. Autumn of 1953 brought early snow, temperature dropping faster than usual for October. Helen split wood with the same methodical rhythm that had sustained her family for 6 years. The pile stood ready, adequate without being excessive, representing confidence earned through seasons of proving what worked. Smoke rose from both chimneys as evening settled, thin columns marking where warmth was being created and circulated through curved space. Inside, Thomas studied by lamplight, preparing for examinations that might lead to engineering school. Margaret practiced teaching methods on Sarah-patient explanations of mathematics that came easier with comfortable temperature and adequate light. Helen moved between stoves, feeding each a single split log. The fires burned low just enough to maintain circulation. The rhythm had become automatic muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions. Add fuel check dampers, monitor heat without needing to measure because her body registered comfort or its absence with practiced accuracy. The hut had aged well. The corrugated steel showed rust in places where drainage failed, but the structure remained sound. The roof held against snow load and wind. The floor, reinforced and insulated over years of incremental improvement, stayed stable and dry. What had been temporary military shelter had become permanent home through maintenance and modification. Neighbors no longer commented on the unusual configuration. Some had built similar systems. Others had chosen conventional construction. None questioned Helen's right to live as she chose or heat as she preferred. The judgment that had marked those early years had faded into acceptance, born from results that couldn't be argued. Frank Morrison, driving past on his way home from town, saw the smoke and remembered his certainty that Helen would fail. Remembered warning her about physics and thermodynamics and the impossibility of heating metal. Felt a particular discomfort that comes from being wrong about someone you dismissed. He had never apologized directly. Too much pride, too much time passed. But he'd recommended her technique to others, acknowledged her innovation in conversations, supported William Ketchum's incorporation of dual stove principles into standard practice. Indirect validation, incomplete but genuine. The broader world remained unaware. No academic studied the thermodynamics of dual-source convection heating in curved structures. No government agency documented the innovation for official distribution. The knowledge stayed local, spread through personal contact, refined through individual experimentation. But within 3 counties of northern Montana, families wintered in surplus Quonsets that should have been uninhabitable. Children grew up warm, wood supplies lasted through harsh months, structures designed for temporary shelter became permanent homes. The gap between expert prediction and practical reality had been bridged by one woman's refusal to accept that physics meant freezing. Winter of 1953 arrived with familiar cold, but no longer with familiar fear. Helen's children had warm beds, adequate food prospects that extended beyond immediate survival. Thomas would likely leave for university carrying knowledge of how to solve problems through observation rather than just theory. Margaret would teach passing to the next generation the value of questioning conventional wisdom when results contradicted predictions. Sarah would remember warmth as normal comfort, as achievable winters, as survivable rather than endurance tests. Helen herself had no plans beyond the immediate. Keep the homestead functioning, maintain the hut that had become home help neighbors when asked. The quiet life of someone who'd fought for survival and won not through dramatic victory, but through persistent application of solutions that worked. On a November evening when temperature dropped to 0 and stayed there, Helen sat between her 2 stoves with mending in her lap. The fires burned steady, low flames consuming fuel at rates that no longer caused panic. The warmth circulated through curved space exactly as it had for years, physics operating according to patterns she discovered without naming. Outside, snow fell across frozen prairie. Inside, her children breathed easily in air that held no frost. The condensation that had once run down walls and streams now appeared only in small patches quickly wiped away. The floor stayed warm enough for bare feet. The curve that should have magnified cold instead channeled heat through endless circulation. 2 stoves, 2 fires, 1. Understanding that emerged from watching what failed and imagining what might work differently. The frontier didn't forgive mistakes, but it rewarded observation. Didn't care about credentials, but recognized results. Traditional knowledge wasn't always ancient. Sometimes it was born in desperation and proven by the coldest nights anyone could remember. Helen fed each stove another log, maintained the rhythm that had become second nature. The flames adjusted the heat, continued its patient movement through space designed for storage, but adapted for living. Tomorrow she'd split more wood. Next week the temperature might drop further. Next year might bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But tonight her children slept warm. Her home held comfort earned through refusing to accept expert certainty over observed reality. And somewhere in the valley, another family burned two fires in a curved steel shell, creating warmth where wisdom said only cold could exist. The knowledge lived independent of its creator now. Helen Vickers had given it to the frontier. The frontier had tested it against Montana winter, and it had survived to become something larger than one woman's desperate innovation. Not famous, not celebrated, just functional, just enough. And on the frontier, enough was everything.